Hi, I'm Joschka Meyer, and during the next roughly 20 minutes, I'll take you on a tour through the Alps in the Middle Ages to explore the lives of humans and animals by looking at how animals were treated and how that was connected with the landscape, the environment, and with a special focus on all things to do with animal health. So this talk is based on a selection of cases from my dissertation project, which I'll use to illustrate some of the key features of alpine human-animal relations. So it's a bit like a sample menu so that you can get insight into various aspects of a huge and complex topic that I just find fascinating. And in order to do all that, I'll firstly give you some context about alpine animal husbandry, including examples of the collective management of animals and how it relates to these different themes that I've already mentioned. After that, the second part, animal health and hard-won lessons, that consists mainly, solely, of two of my very favorite cases that I've discovered during my research, and which to me really exemplify how complex these problems could be when it came to keeping animals, also how bizarre they could be, and well, the ways that people dealt with them. And lastly, what I've called holistic care is about the treatment of animals more generally, first by looking at disease prevention and then pivoting a bit towards looking at how the relationship between humans and animals could be more than extractive or exploitative. Basically, that humans could be willing to treat animals like living beings with their own needs. But first things first, whenever I'm going to say things like Alps back then or something similar, what you can see on this slide now is what I'm referring to. What you have here from left to right is Valais, Uri, Grisons, Liechtenstein, Tyrol, and southern Tyrol in the time period of roughly 14th to the 16th century. Or to put it another way, it's a big part of the Alpine area of what is now Switzerland, a pretty big chunk of Western Austria, a bit of northern Italy, and well, Liechtenstein. And that's the investigation area of my dissertation project, where I'm looking at how rural communities and animals adapted to and used the alpine landscape, using mainly sources originating from villages and so on and so forth. And I have a special focus on topics like transportation and the management of collective resources. Now, one of, if not the most important collective resource were pastures. And what you can see in this beautiful diagram is how they were managed. It's with the Alpwirtschaft. The Alpwirtschaft is pretty much the defining feature of alpine society, and it was developed to cope with a very fundamental problem that, well, mountains presented for living, for agriculture. Because the higher you go, the slower plants grow. And additionally, in the Alps, the soil and the topography were generally not all that ideal for growing crops. And that's the reason why there's a trend that exists until today to instead focus on livestock. It's also one of the reasons why Swiss became synonymous with cheese, because during the late medieval period, cheese became one of the main export products of the area that is now known as Switzerland. So grass grows easier than, for example, grain, but it's still not ideal. It also grows slower. And the Alpwirtschaft tackles that problem. So animals are released in spring and they graze down in the valley at first. They are then driven upwards after the grass had a bit of time to grow, and this is then repeated again and again until the whole thing is done in reverse. And whenever lying pastures aren't being grazed, they are used to produce hay, which then feeds the animals through the long alpine winter. The first traces of the Alpwirtschaft date back to the Neolithic era from the Monze in Austria, and it's still done today. So that's a really profoundly long-lasting model. One could even say maybe sustainable. But all of that success depended upon the careful maintenance and management of spaces and animals. And that's something that people back in the Middle Ages were very keenly aware of. And they tried to adjust to it. These adjustments, deliberations, considerations, whatever, can be seen in the treatment of all animals. And the one that I've chosen now to illustrate that are horses, because horses had to be kept inside the stables for weeks, even after all other animals had been allowed onto the common pastures. One reason for that was most likely that horses tend to rip out grass instead of biting it off. So letting them go first onto a pasture would have been a bit of a waste, because it would have been damaged, less well suited for all other animals that came afterwards. But The prevention of pasture damage can't explain why even after that late release, horses were only very slowly migrated upwards towards the Alps. And the reason for that practice was most likely laminitis. So that's pictured here. That's a potentially inflammation of the hoof, which horses develop if the food contains too much protein and sugar, like newly grown grass. So feeding horses hay for a longer time in spring and only a gradual ascent up to the Alps were customs which counteracted the threat of laminitis effectively. This could have developed through an unplanned process of trial and error. If you let out horses early, they tend to die. If you keep them inside, they stay healthy. And with that, we come to the second part of my talk about hard-won lessons, and the first one is a hard-won lesson indeed. And to me, it's really an exemplary case that shows how such a non-deliberate process of learning and adaptation by trial and error could work, which I call the pigs of Vandea. So, in 1564, members of the Alp cooperative of Lambechen in Grisons complained about the people of Vandea who managed the Alp, and these complaints included the claim that they prevented others maliciously from letting pigs up onto the pasture. The people of Vandea countered, however, that that was a very grave misconception because no one, including they themselves, were allowed to keep pigs on Alps, because otherwise the pigs would die. At this point in the proceedings, the judges interjected, which is a very rare occurrence, and they agreed that customs like that were well known in the region. The reason for that was, to paraphrase them, while sheep and goats might fall off cliffs, cattle tended to get sick, so Alps generally apparently not great for animal health, pigs just died. Witnesses were then called, and one old man said that 30 years before, when the plague was in Vandea, the village decided to put the old wisdom to the test, and he was the one who had to carry it out. So he gathered up all the pigs of Vandea, went with them up to the Alp, arrived there, the pigs were happy, he went to sleep, he woke up, and the pigs were dead. So I thought it was a bit of a tall tale. You know, maybe a couple of pigs died because they ate a poisonous plant or something like that. And over time, every year, another dead pig gets added to the mental death toll in the memory. So I contacted a couple of veterinary experts, and together we were able to determine that in all likelihood, that fanciful tale of the old pig herder was entirely true. So most likely, the cause of death was hemorrhagic bowel syndrome, where the colon of the pig is explosively untwisted. It's a very gruesome death, which can occur within 20 minutes after eating fermenting food. And as one of the experts said, the pigs basically explode internally. Cause of death is, to be exact, massive internal bleeding, and that also causes the corpses to look like big pink balloons. Anyway, the culprit in this case were schotten. It's a kind of curds that are a waste product of the cheese-making process and which were fed to pigs as a kind of recycling. And Vandea is a really special case because here it was a fatal combination of three factors which invariably had to lead to the same fatal result, mass pig death. The first of which was the long trek to the Alp, because that exhausted the pigs and that makes them more vulnerable to everything. Secondly, when the pigs arrived at the Alp, they would have found loads of old schotten curds that they were supposed to eat, and both the amount and the age of the curds made HBS more likely. And thirdly, and most importantly, the reason why people back then could not foresee that happening, why they couldn't just point the finger at the curds as the main issue instead of the Alp kills the pigs, is that they actually regularly fed the pigs curds back home. As recent studies have shown, if pigs grow up being fed curds regularly, they build up a resistance to it. They become immune to that kind of HBS. But that immunity is only for curds from the cauldron that they grew up with, because every cauldron has more or less its own microbiome, and that means an Alpine cheese cauldron is pretty much a poisoned chalice for them. So if we go back to the 1530s, when the village of Vandea in a time of crisis decided to put old wisdom to the test, only to see it confirmed in a really horrifying and mystifying way, that is, I argue, a moment where we can see how practical knowledge, in this case no pigs on Alps, was developed, passed down and reinforced in that very moment, Because just try to imagine, like, what it must have been like. It's a time of crisis, you send the pig herder off, he comes back without any pigs, babbles something about other all died, you go up to the Alp because you want to check for yourself, you look out onto the pasture and just see these grotesque bloated corpses littered everywhere. I mean, that's something that's going to be seared into your memory, both individually and collectively. Anyway, so that I don't end on an extremely grisly note, bit of an addendum. In Tyrol, pigs were actually kept quite frequently on Alps, and it was possible to do so because these three factors weren't in play to that degree. So firstly, the Alps in Tyrol are far lower than in Grisons, which means there's also the possibility that pigs could have eaten something else there, maybe even acorns, things like that. And cheese production in Tyrol wasn't as important or intensive as in Grisons. I have sources, for example, which talk about pigs being driven up to Alps so they could drink milk, which I find bizarre and kind of a waste, but apparently something which was done. And there might even have been a very Tyrolean factor in play, because traditional Tyrolean cuisine is quite heavy on meat and not all that heavy on cheese. And the one traditional Tyrolean cheese is Graukäse. And Graukäse, if you actually look at it, it's basically a lump of curds. You can actually see them. It's unfinished cheese. So, don't really know how to put it very diplomatically. More or less, what I want to say is that the Tyrolese cheese delicacy is something which in Grisons maybe would have been fed to pigs. So it's a possibility that Tyrol could develop a big pig meat culture thanks to humans acting as a kind of curd buffer, protecting the health of pigs. And with that, I'd like to come to my second special case. And yeah, I spare you the preamble, you'll know what it's about very shortly. It also took place in Grisons in the 16th century. So, in this case, a farmer sued a wealthy wine owner for damages because he held the latter responsible for the deaths of his cows. What had happened, according to the farmer, was that in one winter night when he was sick in bed, his cows had broken into a smelter and started to eat the iron that they had found there. The reason why the farmer knew this, and why he thought that the smelter owner was liable due to, as he argued, not cow-proofing his building enough, was that the farmer had noticed something peculiar when his cows got sick. They started to produce glittering cow pies, and he called up a local official to behold his manure pile as a kind of key piece of evidence in advance, and the official testified, it was full of small shiny particles. A short while afterwards, his cows started dying, and he called up another official to attend an obduction of a dead cow. And the farmer performed the procedure himself, and you can see part of the testimony of the official. To summarize, he said that the insides of the cow looked like they had been peeled in some parts. Others were strangely wood-like, brittle, bit like bark, and strewn everywhere about loads of what looked like shiny salt. I once again contacted a veterinarian, a cow expert in this case, and he told me that the farmer had basically done exactly what he, as a modern expert, would have done, and had also correctly deduced what had happened. So the iron had probably been in the form of granules, so think powdery or like small particles, not really big clumps. And that would have been very tempting for cows in the midst of winter, because even at the best of times, cows tend to suffer from a lack of minerals. It's also one of the reasons why cows like to eat and lick all kinds of weird things, including humans. Like if it's summer and you've sweated a lot and you wander into a cow pasture, just be prepared to be licked if you're not careful. Anyway, iron, especially in that region of Grisons, is often found clumped together with quartz. And quartz might look like salt, but it's not only indigestible, but it's extremely hard and it has tons of microscopic and very sharp edges. So the salt that officials saw was quartz, and that was what had peeled the insides of the cows. And the bark, that was coagulated blood. And it's a really fascinating case, tons of further details. But what I want to focus on right here is how it ended, because the judges actually awarded the peasant damages. They agreed with him. And I find that remarkable, because if you look at it, it means a peasant came before a court and the judges agreed, could follow his reasoning, agreed with his arguments, and awarded him damages against a wealthy and influential mine and smelter owner. And that to me implies that these judges must have possessed really a kind of practical knowledge about animals, how they behaved, what could happen, and so on and so forth, which shows that there is really a greater degree of all that suffused throughout society. And it's also just remarkable for the, I'm going to call it, pragmatic approach of the farmer. And with that, we come to the last part of my talk about how animals were treated more generally, starting with disease prevention. So something which is present in all regions that I've investigated, starting from the 16th century onwards at the latest, were epidemic prevention measures like prescriptions to export animals from or travel through an afflicted region, and the duty to kill infected animals and burn their corpses. Next to those large-scale measures, which were implemented and enforced by regional governments, many villages had all their disease prevention rules in their charters, which allowed for the possibility that animals might recover. Potentially infected animals had to be kept strictly separated from others. In Appenzell, as the most extreme case, the rule was that if an animal was sick, all the animals of that farm or herd had to be quarantined for at least 13 weeks. At the end of these 13 weeks, a communal vote was held, and maybe the quarantine was lifted and maybe it wasn't. Quarantine meant not only a physical separation, but also that all animals suspected of being sick were forbidden from drinking from the same water sources as healthy animals, regardless of the time of day and regardless if there were actually healthy animals around at that point. And I think that's really remarkable, because this practice counteracted different kinds of infection vectors, and it also implies a kind of practical knowledge about disease transmission, like that it could spread over water and also linger in water to a certain extent, which went beyond the base assumptions of humorism and miasmatic theory as they were called back then in human medicine. And the degree with which disease prevention was regarded really as a common good can also be seen in a case about Alps and Madretsch in Tyrol, because there a couple of villages had been quarreling for ages about who could use them, own them, and so on and so forth. And all of that was settled when a compromise was reached, which stated that these Alps should now serve as communal quarantine pastures for all villages. So meaning, if an animal was sick in one of these villages, it should be sent up to such an Alp so that it could rest and recuperate there in peace without endangering any other animals. And that was apparently regarded as a solution in the interest of the greater good. So, and lastly, I'd like to offer some examples that show just how Alpine villages could be willing to respect the needs and well-being of animals. And I want to emphasize just some examples, because I have to really restrain myself, because that's just amongst the favorite parts of my research. So, firstly, there were various rules that were aimed at protecting animals from harm. And in the county of Tyrol, at least, that explicitly included even animals that had caused harm themselves. For example, in Riffian, the rule stated that no one should take revenge for damage suffered by livestock by throwing something at them or beating them. And in several villages, the rule stated that behavior like that would be Misshandeln or Misshandlung. And those are terms meaning mistreatment or abuse. So there's a real moral element to it. That's something that you really shouldn't do. And Alpine villages were also willing to make exceptions to otherwise really hard rules if it meant that animals could profit from them. Or to put it another way, if it was needed to break rules in order to help animals. And the first example of that are common pastures, because they were generally really closely guarded against access by outsiders. So who control a pasture, who could use a pasture, were contentious issues. At best of times it could sometimes even get quite violent. But a common exception to that rule, just The only people allowed to use the pasture are the members of that village or association, where if outsiders had work animals that needed a break. And that could mean anything from like a transport animal taking a rest for a couple of hours to graze, up to several days if the animal is injured. And yeah, that was just accepted as an exception to the rule. Another ironclad rule that could be broken was the Alppflicht. So when the time came to drive animals up to the Alps, as many animals as possible had to be driven up, because it was necessary to do so in order to actually gather enough hay to feed all the herds through the winter. The only animals exempt from that rule were a very limited number needed for work, and very young animals like calves. But there were a couple of communities which expressively also allowed cows that couldn't follow the herd up to the Alp because they were injured, lame. In one case, it was stated that if they were too shy, or most remarkably, if the cows were too old. These cows were allowed to join the calves in pastures and forests down in the valley in a kind of what I'm calling combined cattle kindergarten and retirement home. And really, especially the cows that were too old, that's really remarkable, because a cow that is so old that it can't follow the herd up to the Alp anymore, that's a cow that's no longer productive, it's no longer profitable, because it's doubtful that you could use it for work. And cows actually needed to go up to an Alp to turn a profit, like a monetary profit. Otherwise, they wouldn't produce enough milk, and the costs were too high. And despite all that, we have entire communities who said, well, that unproductive animal, you don't have to butcher it or sell it or anything like that. In that case, it can just, it can just take a break down in the valley. And that to me really shows how the relationships between animals and humans in the Alpine regions were also just based on emotional ties. That this was also just a factor that we have to be aware of. It wasn't just based purely on economic logic. So in summary, animals were very important for the rural Alpine population, and people put in a lot of effort to keep animals properly. And proper animal husbandry meant being able to adapt to a complex web of factors, from pasture conditions, terrain, animal characteristics, the interests of various related and connected groups. And those groups could actually include animals themselves. Because although life in the Alps in the Middle Ages wasn't easy, but with iron-eating cows, pigs exploding everywhere, still people were willing and able to treat animals with care, and with care that went beyond mere economic necessity. So with that, thank you for listening, and have a great day.